The real problem is the capitalists who want the economists to say certain things which will benefit their current class domination over society. So to get a concrete example, look at William Nordhaus, right? He made this model called DICE. When it looks at impact on GDP from temperature changes, it doesn't take in any account of ecological tipping points. Global temperatures could go up by an average of 10 degrees Celsius over the next 5 years. And DICE would say that's just a routine hit to GDP, right? GDP might go down like 20%. In reality, that would mean the extinction of the human species. Nothing like that is in danger of happening anytime soon. But my point is, it's just the concept.
Welcome to Moral Footprint, the podcast where we unlearn, rethink, and take action. Today's conversation is one I've been really excited to share because it's not just intellectually rich, it embodies a genuine vision for social transformation that's rooted in the physical limits of our planet. I'm joined by Erald Kolasi, a physicist and economist whose recent book, The Physics of Capitalism, is one of the most eye-opening reads I've come across in a long time. In it, Erald makes a compelling case that our economic system isn't just fundamentally broken, it's at odds with the physical laws that govern life on Earth. He brings thermodynamics, the literal laws of heat and energy, into the heart of our ecological and economic crisis. This episode is for anyone who's ever wondered, why do our so-called technological solutions keep creating new problems? And is there actually a way to build a system that works with nature rather than against it? This isn't just a critique of business as usual. It's a call to remember that physics doesn't negotiate, and that if we want a livable future, we'll need more than just greener tech. We'll need a complete social transformation. I really hope this episode gives you clarity, honesty, and some hope that comes from looking reality squarely in the eye. Hey, Erald, thank you so much for coming to the Moral Footprint podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. Looking forward to a great conversation.
Thank you. I've been reading your new book, The Physics of Capitalism, and so far I found your perspective on our ecological crisis really refreshing. Before we dive into the physics, which is of course your area of expertise, I'd love to hear what sparked your journey to write this book, and what led you to actually connect what might be seemingly separate fields of physics and economics.
A great question. So I think, humanity is at a very critical moment in its history right now, where a lot of the decisions that we make will have profound impacts for the trajectory of human civilization over the next century and really over the next millennium. And there are a lot of great conversations happening about what we should be doing, about what the nature of what are the basic challenges that we face, how should we responding to those challenges, how should we organize society, and there's a lot of ideas out there. Some are great ideas, some I think are bad ideas. I thought this was a good moment to throw my hat into the ring. I've been writing about, the intersection between kind of economics and physics and thermodynamics for quite some time, especially with publications like the Monthly Review. That work led to the idea that, hey, I should write a book about it. So I can clarify some of these big dominant issues that people are talking about right now.
Nice. And then when we talk about thermodynamics, so even the word thermodynamics almost scares me a bit because I think I understand what it means, but can you share why thermodynamics means so much to us grappling with this crisis? It is like a common vein of your book that most people don't understand it, and that's partly why we're here.
Yeah, sure. So thermodynamics is at a very basic level, the study of heat and energy and the flow of heat and energy materials. And so it's relevant for just about every single aspect of your life. So when you drive a car, when you heat your home, when you use your computer or your smartphone, or literally just about anything you do in modern civilization, thermodynamics comes up, right? And it would not be possible without it. So it's relevant in that sense. Now, as to why it's relevant for the big questions that we're tackling now, as I argue in the book, the major issue that we have regarding our ecological challenges is that human civilization is very energy intensive and inefficient. So what does that mean? That means we consume a lot of energy from the natural world. We use that energy, we convert it to do some useful things. For example, into electricity, into mechanical work for our cars and our trains and our airplanes and things like that. But then we dump the vast majority of the energy that we consumed back into the natural world in highly useless and degraded forms, right? So wastewater, solid trash, and greenhouse gases and other pollutants. So, I call capitalism a supercharged entroplex because it's this
I love that
thermodynamic system that is amping up the entropic disorder, if you will, of the biosphere. So it's
kind of creating more chaos, sort of by design.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so that's how thermodynamics comes into it, right? It's understanding that relationship between human society on the one hand and the natural world, where in this case, human society is the system and the natural world, the broader biosphere, are the surroundings, right? And so all of the
Yes.
energy that we're using and dumping into the surroundings, well, they're making the surroundings thermodynamically chaotic and unstable, and that will then reverberate, and has already reverberated on human
Yeah.
civilization. At least we're in the early stages of it, right? But the worry is that it's going to get a lot worse.
Totally. And then the more I read, the more I realize, wow, what we're expecting to happen in the next few decades, we can't really see it or feel it yet. But the trajectory is quite overwhelming, isn't it? What we're kind of saying here is that mainstream economics and the way capitalism works is completely divorced from physical reality. It's not taking into account any of that fundamental nature of reality. So my question is, why is mainstream economics so divorced from reality? Because I also want to mention one of your quotes, which really struck me when I was reading your book. And I'm just going to quote a part of it. And it says, mainstream economics is a propaganda machine designed to protect wealth and power. So presumably there's a benefit to not actually taking this physical reality into account.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I've mentioned before that people complain a lot about neoclassical economists, and I'm one of the first to do that. But the real issue, of course, it's not the economists, right? The real issue are the capitalists who are funding the economists. And so one thing I brought up before is that Rockefeller, he often said that his greatest investment was the University of Chicago, right? All the money that he gave to funding the University of Chicago, which has now become a home cesspool of right-wing economists.
That was kind of the birthplace, wasn't it, of neoclassical economics as well?
I wouldn't say it was the birthplace. You could argue a lot of its birthplace was in Europe with people like von Bauer and Karl Menger and Leon Walras. And others. But once it came to the United States, that was certainly a major incubator.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. We got Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys and all of that, right? So that's an example of what I'm talking about, right? The real problem isn't the economists. The real problem is the capitalists who want the economists to say certain things which will benefit the status quo, right? And which will benefit their current class domination over society. So to get a concrete example, look at William Nordhaus, right? So he made this model called DICE, and it's an integrated assessment model, which is supposed to measure the financial consequences associated with future ecological damages.
Yes.
And there are a lot of problems with this model. And, for people who want the details, you can read the book. But one of the biggest is that, when it looks at the impact on GDP from temperature changes, it doesn't take in any account of what are known as ecological tipping points, right? Or climate tipping points.
Which are non-linear by nature.
Highly non-linear by their nature.
And volatile, yeah.
Exactly. So he doesn't include them at all. So for example, in the DICE model, global temperatures could go up by an average of 10 degrees Celsius over the next, 5 years. And DICE would say that's just a routine hit to GDP, right? GDP might go down like 20%. In reality, that would mean the extinction of the human species. If something like that were, now, nothing like that is in danger of happening anytime soon.
At least not in 5 years.
Yeah. So my point is, it's just the concept. Right.
Yeah.
Let's say there was an exogenous event which forced the Earth system into that kind of temperature increase. That would mean the extinction of the human species. Right. This model cannot account for it because it cannot account for ecological tipping points like the breakdown of ocean circulation systems, which would have those kinds of cases as global temperatures increase, which would have an enormous impact on climate, on flooding, on droughts, on the hydrological cycle. The reason why it's so important to understand the threat that we face from tipping points is because we can be lulled into a false sense of security. You can look outside your home like I am right now when it's sunny and beautiful, and you might think, well, who cares about global warming, right? Give me a few extra degrees.
Yeah.
But
I'm going to get a nice tan.
But the problem is, the more you keep amplifying this instability in the biosphere, the more you risk triggering these ecological tipping points, which, if they're crossed, would lead to sudden, major, irreversible changes that would have profound consequences for human civilization, right? I mean, they would create massive climate refugees and wars and political conflicts and all kinds of chaos that I don't think we want to imagine. And one analogy I often give is, and it's based on something that actually happened, is when the Titanic sank in 1912. So after the Titanic first hit the iceberg, it didn't really go down much into the water, right? It went down just a little bit and then it kind of stabilized and people thought, well, we're fine. There wasn't that urgency to actually get off the boat. So John Jacob Astor, the richest person on the Titanic, he stayed on the boat. He was like, we're safer on the Titanic than in some boat. So he stayed, and he was one of the people who ended up dying because what happened is the vast majority of the sinking of the Titanic happened in the last like 20 minutes or half hour.
Yeah, I guess like you say, when it reached a certain tipping point and you can't really see it happening until, boom, it happens.
Exactly. It's because of all the water that was flooding the compartments underneath. It didn't reach a critical mass until it reached the critical mass, and then the Titanic just went down. And so that is sort of what global civilization is facing. It's nice that it's beautiful and sunny outside my window right now, but it's not going to be beautiful and sunny forever if we keep going in this trajectory.
Well, totally. And what I'm hearing as well is this is very much, in a way, a psychological issue where we have a certain bias collectively where we don't want to know what's happening and we're sort of distracting ourselves from it. You know, there's no shortage of scientific papers saying we've breached now, I think it's 6 out of 9 of the planetary boundaries. The science can say this is happening, and in the 2030s, 2040s, we may have, you know, sudden eradication of all digital financial wealth. We may have the complete shift of the AMOC and so on. But ultimately, it's about people, isn't it? Your work really talks about this concept from Marx, this idea of a metabolic rift, which is essentially how there's a separation now between nature and society. And I wonder if you could share some examples of what is metabolic rift to you, and why does capitalism, I guess, require that separation of people and nature and externalizing costs?
Yeah, thank you. So the term metabolic rift itself actually came from John Bellamy Foster, who's a well-known socialist thinker here in the United States and the editor of the Monthly Review magazine. Right? So he went back, he looked at all of Marx's work, the ecological notebooks that Marx wrote in the 1860s, the Grundrisse, the volumes of Capital, and he saw a real maturity in Marx's thought over time towards ecological issues. Early Marx, what I think many people know, was kind of enraptured by this Promethean vision of industrial production under capitalism, right? This is what appears in the Communist Manifesto. But later Marx, sort of by the 1860s and 1870s, he was actually scared by the Promethean vision of capitalism because he understood it might end up destroying the natural world and therefore, by implication, human civilization itself, right? Since we are a part of the natural world. So if you screw up nature, you screw up society. So, and he was driven to these conclusions later in his life by studying many people, but a big influence was Justus von Liebig. He was a founder of agricultural chemistry, big proponent of fertilizers and healthy soil practices, known for like the law of the minimum, that plant growth is restricted by the least available resource. So he did a bunch of things, right? But one of the things that he became known for is he criticized British agriculture in the 1970s for being very inefficient and taking a lot of critical nutrients out of the soil, but not really replacing them. So for example, he would complain that, you know, the British used to take human waste and they dumped it into rivers and the seas, you know, whereas the Chinese...
I think they still do that as well here in the UK. It's quite a recent issue that hasn't gone away, unfortunately.
This is just a small example, right? Whereas he contrasted with the Chinese, who would use a lot of the human waste for, you know, fertilizing their fields. So Marx was aware of von Liebig's work, and, you know, he began tying it, you know, more and more into his own work. And so it appears in, you know, Capital Volume 1 and Volume 3 and the genesis of, you know, capitalist ground rent, one of the chapters in Volume 3. So this notion that, you know, capitalist production kind of alienates human society from the natural world because capitalist production is interested in scoring a profit, right? And so you don't really care about all the disruptions that you're making to the biogeochemical cycles of the planet and what consequences they could have, because what you really care about are the next quarterly profit margins. So that's what you really care about. You want to show good numbers for your shareholders. And so nature sort of becomes a kind of a means to an end, right? And so that's the rift. That's the rift, that nature is sort of alienated from human society and is sort of, we attempt to make it subservient to us in order to, you know, reach our financial targets. But in reality, as I highlighted in the book and elsewhere, nature is not something that can be conquered, right? So I think this is a flaw in human thinking. We think that we're active and we go out there and do things and we're powerful and we build skyscrapers and canals and bridges. And nature is somehow passive. Nature kind of just sits there. We have all these domesticated animals that we kill every year, billions and billions.
Billions, absolutely.
We do all of these things and we're somehow superior, right? But, you know, as I point out, bacteria and viruses also kill millions, hundreds of millions of us every single year, right? So, and obviously the broader biosphere has a fundamental impact on the trajectory of human civilization, and we're already starting to see the early stages of that. So humanity is not somehow independent from nature. We haven't conquered nature. That's the very notion is silly. Nature cannot be conquered, right? We're just one part of nature among many other parts, and we better learn to get along with the other parts, or the other parts, I think, are going to eat our lunch in the end.
Absolutely. And I think the other issue is this alienation, especially for people who have never, grown their own food. They don't have much relation with nature. They're in cities. They're in a very sort of urban landscape. And I think maybe more people are starting to wake up to actually there's something fundamentally missing there, isn't it? When we're so separate from what actually sustains us. So yeah, of course we have the broader costs of that in terms of changing the biosphere, but also how it impacts us as humans as well, how it actually changes our well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And it affects every aspect of our life. You kind of mentioned cities.
Yeah.
Modern cities are extremely energy intensive, right? There's so many supplies and materials that you need to get to them. And so there's, a lot of fascinating issues about what you could do there. A lot of fascinating things about how we can change our agricultural systems, which right now are responsible for terrible land use dynamics. So in Indonesia, for example, the growth of palm oil plantations is destroying critical peatland soils, which then release amounts of carbon dioxide. So peatland, for example, this is something probably most people don't know. The world's peatland soils contain twice as much carbon as all the world's forests put together.
Wow.
So when you have all these real estate developments and expanding cities and coastal developments, right, and monocropping, right, monoculture plantations and agriculture, it leads to the destruction of a lot of peatlands. And I want to emphasize this because mostly what's emphasized is deforestation, which is a huge problem in and of itself.
Yeah, but
problem
peatlands is potentially a bigger problem.
Is definitely a much bigger problem, and I think an underrated one, because if we end up destroying a lot of these peatlands, which hold so much carbon, you're looking at a vast, pumping of carbon over the next century, which is definitely something that worries me. But it goes to show you about how we're alienated from things because, use your palm oil at home or any other oil, and you don't really know or care much about where it came from, but really all of these things around your life, they took energy to produce. There's a lot of waste associated with them.
And potentially a lot of exploited laborers as well. That's the other missing link. And that's what I find so interesting, that there's so much that's invisible under our current economic system. So my question to you then is, you were talking about agriculture, for example. Do you think with our current capitalist paradigm, could agriculture internalize the costs of the harm that it's causing, or do we actually need like a complete system redesign? What's your take on that? Do you think we can make change incrementally, or do we actually need to completely shift everything?
Well, I would say we need a major system shift. Absolutely. I mean, I think if you stay within the capitalist paradigm, it's clear that monoculture plantations are going to continue to dominate because those are the things that are most cost effective. They're the cheapest. They're what are going to get you the highest profit margins. They're what's going to grow all the grains that we feed to animals, right? So much cropland around the world goes to just growing grains that are, then fed to cows and pigs and things like that. So I don't think you can make a lot of the necessary changes that you need to make within the current capitalist system. And of course, in the book, I outline a new vision, which I call valerism, for organizing industrial civilization in a post-capitalist order. It will take massive systemic shifts in order to live within those critical planetary boundaries that you were referring to earlier. So
I think we can dig into valerism a bit later, because that's almost like your proposed solution, isn't it? But I think it's really interesting to dig more into like, why are we at this point in time? Because I think we have to learn from it, don't we? Before we start saying, okay, this is now what we need to do. And to that end, your book is great at really lifting the lid on what you and other people call climate reductionism. We, of course, had a huge ozone layer issue. Lots of different countries then actually took part. And it's always kind of heralded, isn't it, as a success that we found an ecological issue, we all fixed it. But can you maybe share a bit about climate reductionism in that context?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So what you're talking about is the Montreal Protocol in the 1980s, which phased out chlorofluorocarbons, which were previously used in refrigeration and other things, right? Chlorofluorocarbons, it turned out, if they concentrated a lot in the atmosphere, they blew a hole through the ozone layer. And that was bad because then a lot of ultraviolet light from the sun would get to the surface of the planet, and it would be absolutely terrible for human health, right? And would cause a lot of cancer, a lot of other terrible things. So we didn't want that to happen. So the world came together and very rightfully got rid of chlorofluorocarbons. But then we replaced them, because we needed something for refrigeration. We replaced them with hydrofluorocarbons, right? So a different kind of substance.
Yes.
And those, thankfully, do not punch a hole through the ozone layer because they don't interact with ozone much, but they're very powerful greenhouse gases. So they've amplified the level of global warming over the past few decades. I wouldn't say they've been the major contributor. Those have been, carbon dioxide and methane, but they're becoming an increasingly important contributor, one that's often sort of hushed away by countries. So, Vietnam in the 2010s did something very funny. It magically eliminated 99% of its hydrofluorocarbon emissions from its books because it said, well, research shows that, refrigeration doesn't really release any HFCs, which is completely false and ridiculous. All the research shows that.
So they just were able to write it off.
There's a lot of, refrigerant leaks that happen. So, for example, in your grocery store, when you go there, 25% of the refrigerant leaks every year. So from your own personal refrigerator, there's leaks. So the leaks are very common. But so just right off the problem, right? That's what a lot of countries are doing. And unfortunately, it is a major problem, right? There's a lot of leaks from refrigeration, and those are amplifying global warming on top of other things. So that's one issue in which is, human beings are very good at solving one problem and then creating.
Yes, it's like sort of whack-a-mole, isn't it? We solve one thing and then we create a ton of other like second order or third order effects.
Yeah, absolutely. But to your broader question, I do think, global warming is probably our most severe long-term challenge, but it's definitely not the only one, right? So we have challenges with, biodiversity losses, and most biologists think right now we're in the middle of a mass extinction event. So the Earth doesn't have many of those in its history, right? But we're in the middle of one right now.
Yeah, I think it's the sixth one, isn't it? And as you were saying before, this idea that where we are right now in this moment in time, in 2025, it's actually quite mind-blowing, isn't it? How important it is in the decisions that we make. And so when we look at what global scientific bodies are kind of saying, this is what we need to do, one thing I learned recently was how the IPCC actually does factor in unproven carbon capture technology to get to some of those scenarios. So I think that connects to your critique of climate reductionism, because you mentioned in the book that there are some other unintended side effects of this, because if you focus just on removing the carbon dioxide, you're not factoring in all of the other costs outside of that. Could you maybe share a bit more about why carbon capture isn't our solution, even though, for example, I think it was Tony Blair's institute has said we need to drive huge investment in carbon capture technology. That is now the future. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy to comprehensively destroy the idea right here on your show. Thank you. So let me provide a little bit of context on carbon capture, because it is something that the IPCC and a lot of other people are banking on to kind of save human civilization.
Which is just ridiculous.
So let me provide some context, because I think a lot of people don't know a lot of important things about carbon capture. One is that it was invented by the oil industry in the 1970s for something known as enhanced oil recovery. So what they would do is they would capture the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they would inject it underground in the underground reserves to create a lot of high pressure, and then that pressure would push the oil out, right? So it was designed to actually make it easier to recover oil from mature oil fields that had already been used for several years. That's actually how it started, right? If you look at one of the biggest proponents of carbon capture, it's actually the oil industry. Right now in the United States, there are, I think, about a dozen operational carbon capture plants. All of them are being used by the oil industry. Every single one is being used by the oil industry to help with enhanced oil recovery. Now, the oil industry says that, well, everything kind of nets out because the energy and the emissions associated with the extraction process, well, they're taken out by the carbon dioxide that we're sucking and shoving underground.
Yeah.
But the problem with that argument is it ignores the downstream effect, right? So the downstream emissions. Once you suck the oil out of the ground, well, then you have to take it to an oil refinery, and you have to refine it into gasoline and kerosene and diesel and everything else that we use in modern civilization. And then you have to take it out to gas stations, and then people put it in their car, and then we drive, and all of those things cause emissions as well, right? So you're completely ignoring the downstream effects in this method of accounting that the oil industry provides, right? So that's one example. There's a whole other series of challenges, and let me get to them now. So there was people who support carbon capture, one number they'll cite is they'll say, it captures like 90% of the emissions from a power plant or something like that. And a lot of those numbers are based on like highly idealized and simplistic demonstration projects.
Funded by big oil, potentially?
So when researchers have actually gone to real world operational power plants and have looked at the carbon capture systems that are working there, was it Jacobson from Stanford did this a few years ago, right? So there's a professor, a civil engineering professor from Stanford, went to Texas and looked at a coal power plant, and he basically determined after observing it for almost a year that actually it captures directly about 55% of the emissions that are produced by the coal power plant, not 90%. So there's a lot of real world variability in the actual performance of these systems, right? If you go past the test and demonstration projects and look at how they're actually doing in the real world, there's a lot of problems. But there are bigger problems than that. Carbon capture systems, they need energy in order to work. It's not like the tooth fairy comes and then they suddenly turn on. So right now, typically what people use to get them going is natural gas turbines. So in other words, there's different kinds of carbon capture systems out there. There's like amine gas treatment, which is what's mostly used in the oil and gas industry. And that's responsible for most of the carbon capture that's happening right now. And amines are like nitrogen compounds that are very good at like interacting with carbon dioxide and like sucking it, basically bonding with it.
Okay.
Right? So they suck it out when the flue gas or the exhaust gas from the power plant goes through a column. It's lined with amine. The amine captures the carbon dioxide. I'm not going to go into a lot of the technical and chemical details there, but that's one major process. The other process is direct air capture. This is probably what most people think of when they think of carbon capture.
That's what I imagine when I think of
direct air capture. And the reason why is because it's becoming increasingly popular because you can kind of put it anywhere and capture carbon dioxide that's just generally out there in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. Whereas with amine gas treatment, well, you can only do that on site. You can only do that at a particular facility. So it doesn't offer you the same scalability and flexibility as direct air capture. So that's why a lot of people now are
that's interesting.
Pushing direct air capture. But in either case, it doesn't really affect this argument. In either case, both processes are very energy intensive, and they're often powered by natural gas turbines, which are obviously emitting greenhouse gases. And furthermore, there's a lot of upstream effects. So for example, to get the natural gas on site, well, obviously first you have to extract it from the ground through hydraulic fracking. Then you have to push it through a bunch of pipes using compressor stations and other things. All of that is very energy intensive. All of that, there's a lot of methane leaks in the natural gas industry. So, people, they think that if you look up what is the human activity that most emits methane, the internet will tell you it's cows belching, right? Yeah. But in reality, independent studies have shown that the natural gas industry is by far the biggest emitter of methane in the world. And that's because there's a lot of methane leaks that are happening all across the process, right? So in the wellheads, from venting, from flaring, in the pipelines. There's a lot of methane that leaks into the atmosphere from the normal operations of the natural gas industry. So those upstream emissions are not counted at all when you're just looking at what the carbon capture system is doing over here, right? You're ignoring all the upstream stuff, you're ignoring the downstream stuff. And when this researcher at Stanford looked at it comprehensively, the upstream and the downstream effects, he realized that this carbon capture system at this plant would basically remove 10% of all of the carbon emissions that are associated with keeping this carbon capture system operational, right?
So when you were saying before our entire system is inefficient, that is making the perfect case, isn't it? That we're choosing solutions that actually don't solve the problem completely. It's not addressing the root causes, is it?
No, it's not. And I could keep going about carbon capture of the time, including that right now the installed capacity is a small, minuscule fraction of all the vast greenhouse gases.
I guess your point is that we should not bank on it working, because also from a physics standpoint, you're saying it's likely not going to be this silver bullet that everyone is hoping. It goes back to what people with, some form of optimism bias, we want these technologies to work. But even when we talk about renewables, in your book, you talk about how renewables themselves, they require huge amounts of fossil fuel to even, to get created. So each time it goes, I'll use the phrase again, it feels like we keep whack-a-moling our way through this. And I think just sort of tied to that, I want to, before we touch on that a bit further, in your book, you talk about how we actually need social transformation more than technological fixes. So I would love for you to talk about how we move beyond techno-solutionism, given every single thing that we think is going to solve our issues is actually causing other issues.
Yeah, great question. And so this is one of the major points and themes of the book, I would say, is that technological innovation by itself is not going to solve our fundamental problems. We need fundamentally social and political transformation, new ways of organizing our society, of how we use energy, of who holds power, of how wealth and income are distributed, of all these complicated issues, right, sort of brought together. Now, That doesn't mean then you can't have technological innovation. You obviously
Yeah.
can, and we're going to need a lot of technological innovation in certain areas, but it can't be the primary strategy. Right. So that's sort of the point that I make in the book. And, you mentioned renewables. That's absolutely right. So in the book, I end up favoring an aggressive transition towards renewables, but I throw a
Yeah.
big but, which is a huge difference from the current capitalist trajectory we're on, which is we have to make a lot of downscaling efforts in a lot of other economic sectors. So you can't just radically upscale renewables and ignore
Yeah.
everything.
And maintain business as usual.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
Because, as you pointed out, so much of our existing industrial capacity is locked into fossil fuels, right? So
Yep.
China, for
Yeah, it'd be
example,
disastrous.
China produces 55% of the world's aluminum, right? And aluminum is a critical input in renewables like solar panels and things like that. And China, over 70% of that aluminum is produced from coal-fired plants and fossil fuel plants, which then generate the electricity, which is used in electrolysis for one of the industrial processes that gets you aluminum, right? The Hall-Heroult process, if you want to
Yeah.
anyone's interested. So that's an example, right? Another example, when you mine for lithium, well, to mine deep underground, you need these giant vehicles called rotary blast hole drills. And the vast majority of them are operated through diesel engines, right? So they emit a lot of, greenhouse gases when they drill through the earth to get to the lithium or the copper or whatever you want to get. Now, there has recently been a push towards the electrification of industrial vehicles and machines. And that's good news. So now you're starting to see electric excavators and tandem rollers. Sandvik last year actually came out with electric rotary blast hole drills, which is great, right? So, but the point is the scale is nowhere there yet. And if it's left to capital itself, we're never going to get there. They're never going to make the necessary investments for this kind of transition that we need. So that's the point that I was getting to there is, yes, we need an aggressive transition towards renewables, but because so much industrial capacity is locked into fossil fuels, you have to then balance that with corresponding downscaling effects in other economic sectors. I give many examples of that. One of them is, reducing beef consumption, right? So reducing beef consumption would help with a million things.
Yeah,
Methane
exactly.
emissions, reducing emissions from peatland soils because you don't have to expand agriculture, and a million other things, right? Less deforestation. I could go on and on. So that's an example of the kind of thing that you could do, right? And it doesn't mean that we stop eating meat. If you like meat, that's great. It just means that, hey, maybe instead of eating meat like once a day, you eat it like 3 times a week. And, and I think that is the kinds of solutions that we need to be thinking about. That's just a small example, right? Obviously, I lay out an entire comprehensive vision.
Absolutely. And I guess it's about taking an honest look, isn't it? About this is how we're living currently. And it doesn't matter how we got here. What matters is we're here and we need to make changes. But what I've noticed, you talk about downscaling various industries, but I believe from your book, you don't really use the term degrowth as such. And so I wanted to ask if that was a deliberate choice, and how does your framework work in relation to degrowth and other related theories?
Yeah, a great question. And so I've always said that there's a lot in my work that strongly overlaps with a lot of the degrowth literature, right? So, I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, this was a book that was published through the Monthly Review, which is a publication that supports ecological socialism and has had a lot of degrowth writers write for it. But there's also some major differences that we could get into. So one of them is there's a lot more emphasis in the Valerism framework on the political ecology side of things. So organizing the state, coming up with new global institutions for managing the global ecological commons. So there's a whole kind of political dimension which is found in some of the degrowth literature, but isn't really the main emphasis. Whereas in my book, I make that a major emphasis in the last 2 chapters, right? In reconceptualizing the nation state in a Valerist world order, in recognizing that to manage the global ecological commons, you're going to need a lot of top-down control. So you're going to need global forms of coordination. You're also going to need local forms of political and economic management. And, we can talk about all that later. So that is one kind of maybe, an attitude shift, if you want to call it, is just a lot more emphasis on the political ecology side of things. And political ecology as a field has existed for a while, right? So I'm following in a long tradition of other scholars, but it's often not married very well with ecological economics or just kind of ecological thought in general.
Yes.
In other words, with a lot of other people, whether in degrowth or other areas that are working in these fields, like these two kind of subfields in ecology don't really come together that well, that often. So that is one thing that I try to rectify in the book is to kind of have this global political dimension to how we actually manage the global biosphere, which is a practical problem you're going to need to resolve, right? At the end of the day, it's not about science and numbers. It's how do we, what would political system in this new world order actually look like? How would it work, and why should it work that way, and all those things? That's one difference. Another difference is that I make very clear in the book that the financial world is important, obviously, for our social world because money governs everything. Money is how you buy things, and money is how you invest in the stock market, and money determines whether you're, homeless on the streets or, drinking, eating caviar, right? So the financial world is extremely important, but financial indicators like GDP and other things, mainly what they're indicating is they're indicating something about the social and class power dynamics of the capitalist system. They're not necessarily indicating something fundamental about the aggregate biophysical scale of the economy, right?
Yes.
So that's a whole other issue. And so the metrics that I prefer for analyzing where we should be going and the kind of caps that we should be using, they're more biophysical than what is often found in the degrowth literature, which is kind of a focus on GDP, even though most degrowth people dislike GDP and they prefer.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
They prefer alternative metrics of progress. Nevertheless, in their academic papers, they say, well, in some of them, we should reduce GDP, or some people don't even prefer reducing it. They prefer just kind of like, slowing down the rate of GDP growth. But the focus a lot is on GDP. Right. And I have absolutely no interest in GDP. If you look at the recommendations that I make, they're mostly of the biophysical nature. So one of the major recommendations I make is that all nations on Earth should cap, their annual average daily per capita energy use at 60,000 kilocalories. So Britain, where you live, it's about 70,000 right now. So Britain wouldn't have to do much at all to get there. States is at about 180,000. China is at 70,000. So there are a lot of countries that are actually close, and it's a totally realistic and doable goal. Meanwhile, countries like India are at around 25,000 kilocalories. So they have a lot more room to grow. Right? So valerism, by the way, comes from the words valence and regeneration. Valence in this context meaning stability. That's the big theme,
which is what we badly need.
The big theme of the book, from growth to stability. One of the things that means in a macroenergetic context is sort of these managed fluctuations in energy use and waste generation around a dynamic equilibrium. So in the book, I say a valerist society should stay somewhere between 30,000 kilocalories per day, again, annual average daily per capita, and 60,000, right? So 60,000 should be the cap. That's to give societies flexibility. So, really what I want to do is I want to lower the global average of 50,000, but it's unrealistic to say, well, the average should be 42,000 kilocalories, and that's what's
regardless of which country.
Right. The global average should be 42,000, and that's consistent with our ecological footprints and all that. And all of that may be true, but the problem is it's very difficult to enforce that kind of global average, whereas it's much easier to enforce a universal cap. Right, because the idea is all the nations of the world, and then you would have these global forms of governance, which I talk about in the book, the Cosmopole, that would be collectively working at enforcing this cap. And this would be like the most important cap in human civilization, right? We would not pass this because of all of the issues that we've been talking about, right? Living within our planetary constraints. And so this is one of the ways that I talk about for preserving industrial civilization for a long, long time to come without, transgressing these critical planetary boundaries, without running the risk of tipping over into these tipping points. And so that's valerism with its foundational principle of stability. Then I outline a bunch of other design principles, right? I call them the 4 pillars. So stabilization.
Yes, and I just want to pick up one thing that you've talked about here, because there's a lot of schools of thought in the social justice space around climate that actually are saying we need to move away from power in few hands. We need to go back to a bottoms up approach, almost like a sort of anarchist. We do not need the state. But what your point is that actually the issues that we're facing, because it impacts the global biosphere, we will need that layer of power. How then do you ensure, if you have this form of global governance, the Cosmopole, that it is truly democratic and doesn't replicate what we currently have?
Yeah, good points. The first place I want to begin is by highlighting that everywhere in recent human history where you've seen a major energy transition, like the French going to nuclear power or the Dutch transitioning to natural gas after discovering the Groningen field in 1959. Another example, I talk about societies that save themselves from ecological disasters or impending ecological disasters. So Tokugawa, Japan is an example that I bring up a lot because it's a phenomenal example. It's probably the best example of large-scale ecological adaptation that actually saved a society, right? And all of these examples, the state was absolutely fundamental at carrying out the necessary transition, right? So it wasn't a bottom-up approach that did it by itself. There was a lot of
Yeah, it wasn't organic. It had to be planned because of what was at stake.
yeah. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the local power systems, they resisted a lot of the necessary changes that had to be made for the good of society, right? I'm definitely not an anarchist. I imagine a whole new global international system that would replace the current system based on the United Nations, which came after World War II, as you know, and reflects the power dynamics that emerged after World War II. So it's sort of ridiculous that India, the largest country in the world right now, doesn't have like permanent power in the United Security Council. There's a lot of issues with the global system where it's just not representative of, the actual globe and the people that live in it. Right, very representative of the global north and very exploitive of the global south. So these are parts of the problems. There's some collective interests and global interests which outweigh the interests of any given nation. Right, if the biosphere collapses, then all nations go kaput. Right, so it doesn't matter how much you love your country if the storms are dumping biblical levels of flooding and your capital city is destroyed, there goes your country. Right, so I also believe in global layers of governance to make sure that there's proper levels of enforcement for all of these ecological and energy standards and changes that we're talking about, right? You need that kind of top layer. And so how does it work in my system? Well, I talk a lot about how, the current systems that we have, they're very undemocratic. They don't represent the aspirations of people. They're very bad at achieving big, massive things that we need to achieve.
Like we can barely get anything done incrementally.
Yeah, exactly. And so I propose an entirely different vision for how we should structure our political systems. And at the root of it is sortition. So this is a concept from ancient Greece where it's random lotteries of citizens that are selected to positions of power. And so
almost like a jury.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically a lottery. So I would get rid of elections for legislatures is one of the things I propose in the book. I could still support them for executives. So to elect, for example, the president or other things like that, that's fine. It gets a little bit hairy in parliamentary systems like yours, because obviously there the legislative and the executive are very tied together. But the point is I support this system of sortition because it would lessen a lot of the problems that we have in our current systems, which is they're entirely captured by the rich, right? So in order to even get a position of power, you have to grovel at the feet of some corrupt capitalist overlord because you need a lot of money. To be elected to Congress in the United States, for example, it's all about money. Regular people can't compete. So this system would get away with that. It'd be just random lotteries of eligible citizens that would go to Congress, and they'd be replaced every few years or so. What I also propose is, in addition to the legislatures, who I would make kind of the centers of power within any given national system, I proposed in a global legislature, which I call the Cosmopole. Yeah. And so the Cosmopole would be chartered specifically to manage ecological and energy issues. So it would have powers like power to establish parks, to cancel development projects, to do other things like that, right, that are implicated with stabilizing the ecological order. But I clarify that it would not have the power to do a lot of things like tax people. So it would not have the power to say, if you make $200,000 a year, you're going to face a tax rate above that 200,000 of 32.5%. It would not have that power. That power would still belong to the national governments, right? It would not have the power of monetization, right? So just or quantitative easing from the central bank. So just flooding the economy with money, that would still belong to the central government. However, the powers that it would have would indirectly implicate the nature of economic development in all nations around the world. And that is precisely the point, to make sure that, nations like Indonesia or the United States or Brazil don't start destroying the Amazon and destroying their rainforests because they want to build a few more palm oil plantations, right? So that is an example of where the Cosmopole would come in and say, no, you're not doing that. An example of where a global layer would overrule a local layer. So I think that is absolutely critically important if you're going to transition to this new kind of world, to be thinking about political governance at the global level and what it would actually look like. And the important point that I emphasize too in the book is there would be no executive or judicial branches at the global level. It would just be the Cosmopole. So the reason why that's great is because there would be no dictator that could emerge. So there's no dictator, because
by design it's not possible.
By design it's not possible. Now, of course, in any given Cosmopole, you're going to have some people that emerge in that session that have more power or whatever. That's normal. That's humanity. But the point is, then they would be replaced by the next wave of incoming cosmopolists, as I call them, through partition. And so, yes, they might do some damage in that point, but then they'd be replaced, and then the new wave would come in and hopefully would be better. And if the Cosmopole gets it wrong, which it will from time to time, it'll make a bad decision because, again, we're human beings. We make mistakes. Well, then a later session of the Cosmic Bowl can correct the mistake, right?
Let's discuss your valerism framework then in regard to the 4 pillars and how they interconnect with each other.
Yeah, so in valerism, these 4 pillars, I also call them design principles. They're essentially design principles for organizing industrial society. And so the 4 pillars are stabilisation, socialisation, modularisation, and localisation. Now, we've already talked quite a bit about stabilisation, right? So that's, stabilizing energy use and resource consumption and waste generation and all of those things, right? But from an ecological standpoint. But there's also an economic dimension to it, and that's setting up universal social programs like, universal childcare and healthcare and education and things like that, right? So I won't say much about that, but there is both an ecological and an economic dimension to this concept of stabilisation. Socialisation is the notion that we need to bring a lot more resources under democratic and public control, because having that kind of public control would allow for large-scale social coordination on rapid timescales, on the kind of rapid timescales that we need to achieve a lot of the big things that we need to achieve, right? Like an energy transition towards renewables would be the classic example. So for socialization, I'm in favor both of, local cooperatives at the local level, but also, nationalizing some big industries, some energy intensive industries with high capital costs and little competition that almost function like de facto natural monopolies anyway. So, utilities, steel, construction, oil and gas, a bunch of things like airlines. I would be in favor of fully nationalizing or mostly nationalizing those industries. And that would allow the state the ability to set production levels and quotas instead of capitalists who will set whatever they want to be profitable in any moment they want. And the great thing about the state doing that is the state doesn't have to be profitable. It can just monetize away all of the losses, and it's going to have losses in most of these businesses, especially airlines. If you're going to restrict the amount of flights, for example, that people are allowed to have, the airlines are going to have losses, but it's fine. The state can monetize them away through the central bank. You just have the airline sell corporate bonds to the central bank in perpetuity. The central bank just keeps pumping the airlines full of money, and so they can keep paying people even more than they're paid now, even though their revenues are going to decline. So that's part of like how that vision comes together. You need a strong dose of nationalization because that will allow the state to have direct levers of control over production, consumption, distribution. And that's so important for managing the energy dynamics of the economy in a way that cannot be done at more local miniaturized level if you allow capitalists to do it.
Yes. So how does your framework think about where there is big business who, for example, currently already have more power than various nation states? We won't potentially be able to nationalize everything. And how do we then prevent industries that aren't nationalized from just doing what they were doing before with the sort of valerism framework, given that we need to move beyond growth towards balance?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, I don't support nationalizing everything. I don't, for example, nationalizing, the food and restaurant industry or the hotel industry or the software.
Yeah, so there's always going to be that commercial aspect, isn't there?
Right. Of course, I believe in private enterprise. I say I support a mixed economy, but I also believe in the state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, as Marx said. And to answer your question, well, everything in an economy is interconnected, right? So the commercial businesses, they're going to be doing business with the state businesses because they need to get resources and materials, right? You need to get oil and gas to do whatever you're going to do and all of these things. So their activities will be profoundly impacted by what the state companies are doing.
I see.
And whenever they have financial losses, again, those losses can also be monetized away, right? Or they can be properly managed by the state, right? So we're not going to let commercial companies and private enterprise in the dust just because we nationalized a few companies. Financially, everybody will be taken care of. But really what matters is what is happening with the biophysical energy dynamics of it all, right? And the point is those will be stabilized now through this sort of top-down and also bottom-up levers of control.
So when we talk about modularization, what does that mean in principle? And then from there, if you can also then talk about the 4th pillar.
Yeah, so modularization in principle, it's having an economy based on reusability, interchangeability, and prefabrication. And so I support the creation of a modular society that runs on these modularized principles from end to end. So that means from, industrial manufacturing and construction all the way to end-use consumption, right? And so I'll say a little bit about what all that means in the context of a few examples. So modularization is extremely important for reducing waste, energy, and emissions. It's also extremely important for rapidly achieving big things. For example, a lot of socialist and communist governments after World War II, the reason why they built so much housing is because they relied on these modularized panels. They allowed them to build these apartment towers very quickly. Right? It's the kind of things that we often don't do in the West because we're worried about luxury aesthetics. We still make fun of, the apartment towers in Eastern Europe for looking ugly, while
even though they got the job done.
They got the job done, and millions of our people are homeless, because God forbid we had somewhat ugly houses so everybody could afford to live. That's a joke, but you understand what I mean. So modularization was a critical part of how they did that. Modularization is used in some places in industrial manufacturing, but not as often or as much as I'd like to see. So Volkswagen, for example, has its MQB platform, which is it's a prefabricated chassis with a pre-installed transverse engine. On top of that component, Volkswagen builds all kinds of different cars. It's almost like a Lego set. They have all these modularized components that go into it, and then you can build different cars from it. And they've built millions of cars this way. It's one of the most efficient production methods in the world. And so these are the kinds of modularized strategies. But the point is, this would go all the way through to end-use consumption. What do I mean there? Right now, we live in a world where customization reigns in modern capitalism. We have thousands and thousands of different types of chairs and tables and, maybe, computers and all kinds of other consumer goods. So I propose severely restricting the scope of customization. This is another place where modularization will come up, right? So instead of having a world with 20,000 different types of tables or more, let's have a world with like 200 different types of tables. And the interior designers, they want to kill me right now. I know that. But the point is, by restricting that scope, you can develop highly efficient production methods for all of these things.
Yeah, so it's essentially saving energy as well. That's why it makes so much sense.
Exactly. You could come up with modularized components for all of these things. So if your child draws on the sofa, on your furniture somewhere, or let's say they damage part of it, instead of replacing the entire thing, just replace that part and put in a new part. But this would be much easier having these modularized components if you restrict the scope of customization.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what it would do. And fundamentally, what modularization would do is it would change the structure of technological development under capitalism. So this is not something we talked about, but I have a whole new theory of technological development under capitalism.
Maybe if we have a second podcast later.
We can talk about that. Yes. The point is that the way technological innovation works under capitalism is very energy intensive. Modularization would be a way to resolve that. It would be a way to have technological change so that it's not so energy intensive. Modularization, another thing it would do in the Valerism system is it would fundamentally change the nature of technological development so it's not so energy intensive. Okay, before I get to localization, I want to say that all of these pillars, they're designed to work jointly and collectively. So you can't pick and choose, right? That's one thing I emphasize in the book. Like,
they're sort of interdependent.
They're interdependent. If you don't do them all, then it's not going to work. Localization is the idea that we should manufacture and produce as much as we can locally. So it's a pretty simple idea because, international trade is extremely energy intensive. Our current industrial supply chains are extremely energy intensive. And there's a lot of opportunity there for localizing things so that, again, we reduce waste generation and energy use. Now, there's obviously some things that you can never change. So the United States cannot produce mangoes and bananas. We're always going to have to get those from somewhere else. The United States doesn't have a lot of rare earth metals. So we're going to have to get a lot of them from China or other places, right? We're still going to have to get a lot of sand from other places around the world and a lot of these critical resources that we need, right? But there are some industrial supply chains that you can bring locally, and there's definitely a lot of manufacturing that you can bring locally. And I think that is so critical for, one, reducing the energy intensive nature of international trade, but also from preventing modularization from going crazy. Because if you do modularization without localization, then all that's going to happen is a bunch of corrupt capitalists are going to go to some countries with cheap labor. They're going to prefabricate all of their components there. They're going to ship everything through Maersk and all the shipping lines, running all these massive ships running on diesel engines, producing a lot of greenhouse gases. And of course, there's other forms of waste. So it's going to lead to an energy intensive system just so they can get the prefabricated components to where you need them to be so you can modularize and build whatever system you want, right? So modularization without localization would not work. Modularization is also very expensive. Who's going to cover the costs? Private capital isn't going to do it. That's why you need the state. That's why you need socialization. You kind of get the idea of how everything is sort of interconnected, right? You can't just say, modularization sounds great, and then ignore everything else,
and
right?
continue everything else as usual, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that's coming to mind as well, especially with localization, is it would have various co-benefits, not just from an energy standpoint. We talked earlier, didn't we, about metabolic rift, that so many people are sort of separated from natural processes that sustain them. And correct me if I'm wrong, but also with localization, it's about making visible our connection to nature within our local environment in a way. It's not just expecting always to have everything seamlessly coming from another country. We have no idea who made it. And that's what I love about your framework is it's actually not just solving the energy or the ecological issues, but it will have those co-benefits.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a great example. People would be much more aware of what is happening in their surrounding environment because now we're producing and organizing this stuff, right?
And they'd be dependent on it. They would need to care.
Yes, they would need. Right, yeah. And I think there'd be other kinds of co-benefits. So like, bringing more manufacturing back at home, I think is great for political reasons, because that's one of the big reasons why the working classes have shifted towards the right recently in the United States, in Europe, in a lot of other places, a lot of deindustrialization, which was a terrible idea that was done because capitalists didn't like expensive labor in the Western.
Yeah, they just wanted to have cheaper costs, didn't they?
They wanted to have cheaper costs, and so they went everywhere else. And again, this is where you would come in with the state, because private capital is not going to come back on its own, right? So you need
because it's potentially going to cost more money.
So it's not. So you need state-led industrial organization to make all of this happen. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Right? So you need the state to cover all of the extra costs, to actually pay people living wages, benefits, things like that, because private capital isn't going to do it. So again, another example of how sort of everything ties together, and as you said, all the benefits that are associated with it.
Great. So for listeners who are navigating these very complex challenges, and in the absence yet, and potentially in the future, maybe there will be the Cosmopole and all of the other aspects, but what kind of key insights do you have for what they can do differently from tomorrow? How can they maybe rethink how they approach systems change, just to give us some concrete ideas of how we can take your work and bring it forward into the real world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's many different things that we can all do, right? I mean, for some people, it's making different lifestyle choices at an individual level, and that's totally fine. I wouldn't say it's perhaps the most effective strategy in general, because I think corporations over the past few decades, they've put this notion of environmental responsibility on the individual, and us using less plastic and things like that. And it's great to use less plastic, but you need social policies to actually back that and organize it, and all the kinds of things that we've talked about, right? It can't just be an individual choice, but individual choices can help a little bit like that. I think things that are likely to have more impact are honestly just political pressure, right? So keeping up political pressure, whether that's writing to your elected officials, whether that's protesting, I think political pressure, and communicating with other people in your community, letting them know why this stuff is important and why it matters. So I think, organizing, protesting, putting pressure on the political system, those things over the long run are more likely to yield sort of bigger results.
I love that. And also, just from my perspective, in the UK, the Green Party, they're not funded by billionaires, but some of our mainstream political parties are. It's also about your everyday person starting to realize that there are various political factions who are trying to stand up for things like universal childcare, which you talk about in the book, universal basic income. All of these things, they are open to us. We just have to somehow circumvent the role of big business and finance in our political systems, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And how we do that is the $1 million question, right? And so there's a lot of theories about how it's done. I've often been asked, like, by people who are supportive of my ideas, it's like, well, you have great ideas, but how do we get any of this stuff, right? I mean, capitalists are not going to allow it. And I absolutely agree. If it was only up to capitalists, they're not going to allow it. But I will also say human history is very dynamic and unpredictable. And you
totally.
You don't know what's going to happen, right? And the system could experience a great moment of stress that allows it to buckle, bend, and maybe even break a little bit. And in that moment, there could be a revolutionary opportunity to remake much of the existing world order. And so when that opportunity comes, I think it's important to have the kind of North Star, the vision that I and others are providing, so that when we have this revolutionary moment to remake the world, we're not running around like headless chickens wondering, well, what should we be doing?
Yes, we can pick up a copy of The Physics of
That's cool.
Capitalism. We can listen to this podcast and we can find our way to a better world. That's what I've taken away from our conversations today, that we're not short of solutions. We just need to realize that techno-solutionism is not the answer. We need to marry that with genuine social transformation.
Absolutely. Well said.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your insights and your book with us today. I've learned a ton. I'm sure our listeners have too. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jenny.